So I thought I would actually start with you, Russ, and say if you had a recommendation other than you gave us your broad recommendations about needing larger ends and pre-publishing your plan and so on, but specifically for thinking about brain health, are there issues that you would like to bring to our attention from the measurement point of view? Do you think it's a hopeless task? Do you think it's a possible task? And what would it look like, dreaming the dream?
Right. So I should say I have no idea what "quote unquote" brain health actually means in terms of what you really want to measure. But let's say that that somebody could convince me that there was something that measured some construct that we can interpret as brain health. I mean, the one thing, and then they want to go do studies to kind of establish that as, some sort of useful measure for other purposes. I think that the one issue with where, the field has gone in general in the last decade is that we've interpreted the concept of quote unquote big data in one very limited way, which is, getting a relatively small amount of data from a relatively large number of people, 1,000, 100,000, whatever that number might be. Across all the studies. And I think that what we've learned from things like MyConnectome is that, that's really sort of underserving us, both in the sense that, we have, your ability to analyze things at those large scales is really going to be limited by the quality of the measurement of the individual. So we need much more sensitivity to the degree to which we're measuring a stable phenotype at the individual level, even if it's just stable within a day. So that gets back to the question about like how much resting state data do we need, right? And then I think we also need to think about, looking across phenotypes, right? So the field has in general done very little in terms of like saying, what happens if you take an individual and measure them across lots of different things, right? There's a couple of ongoing studies doing this, but that lets us start, really sort of pulling together, realizing that when, it may be that we're testing people on, 20 different tasks, but we're really only measuring 3 things, right? And so I think that we need to people in data science sometimes refer to this as the data cube, right? The data can be big along a lot of dimensions, and I think we need to think much more broadly in terms of how it is that we envision the kind of data that you would need to really establish these things.
I just want to echo that point and emphasize the importance. So the work I presented today benefited from shared data. So I sort of built models in one data set and then externally validated them in many shared data sets. And those were typically these sort of like long data sets, so a little bit of data from a lot of people, but also the wide data sets. I think I have that direction correct. A lot of data from the same person is really useful. So I advocate like everyone share your data because it gets recycled in a way that's just beneficial for everyone involved. But I also think it's really important to share models. So Russ emphasized in his talk the importance of validating models outside the particular data set in which you train them. And so I think, we don't just need to share our data, but we also need to share our models. So feature weights, prediction algorithms, so people can sort of take them and apply them to their own data if there are, for example, restrictions on how they can share that. And that can really inform, the degree to which things we're claiming are biomarkers, to what degree are they actually general.
Yeah, that's great. And that's something that the genetic community had learned how to do a while back, and we're behind in neuroscience, and I hope we catch up with it because, they've learned some hard lessons, including on biomarkers and this need to not, claim things too early based on your training set and that sort of stuff, that we don't need to reinvent the wheels. We can look at other fields and learn a lot from the value of how to share, how to analyze, including algorithm, how to, integrate information. Do you have any comments on it?
Separate question.
Okay.
I'm just wondering about what the group thinks about, given Russ's comment about the failure of the DSM-5 categories being meaningful biological categories that we can predict. What do people think about the RDoC matrix, an attempt to try to come up with a different classification system? Is that, I didn't hear anything about it today, and I thought someone might have feelings about it.
So do people know, everybody know what RDoC is? Right. So I mean, it's a system that the NIMH in particular has put forward, which is more dimensional, that looks at cognitive function, affective valence, things like that, that says you should be studying and measuring these dimensions instead of measuring disease, and that would yield more connection to biology, more translation between animal and human models. So that's kind of the alternative to the DSM. Tom Insel, the previous NIMH director, championed that idea, and I think it's still ongoing as a somewhat of a preference under the current NIMH director. So do people have experience with that, especially cognitive neuroimaging people? Do you guys feel like that's helpful?
So for anybody online, this is Damien again. I think that in many ways the kind of the breaking out of the DSM, what Hyman used to say, cognitive box with the RDoc was very helpful to kind of break out of trying to do every study based on DSM cut categories, which I think was very limiting as far as the neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, trying to understand the neurobiology or neurophysiology. There's certainly lots of limitations, I think, of the RDoc, but the themes, like kind of thinking of items in terms of dimensions and subpopulations and things like that is really, really helpful. So it's kind of I think it's probably safe to say that it's kind of a yes and no. It's very helpful in some ways, particularly in moving the direction of the work, but in other ways there's still some limitations that need to be worked out.
My concern is that it's also invented by a committee as opposed to biologically based. So it is replacing one orthodoxy with another orthodoxy. The advantage is that it broke the mold. And so I see the advantage of encouraging people to think in function as opposed to disease. And that is especially relevant if you're trying to think about healthy people and not wait to the earlier point that we made to the end stage where somebody has completely fallen apart before you start studying them. There is no phenotype when before somebody is, let's say, completely depressed. What is the phenotype you're studying? You need some kind of dimensionality to think about if you don't want to have just a disease-based approach. So there's advantages to it in my mind, but I also don't feel that it's based on anything biological. It has exactly the problem you talked about in terms of pencil and paper tests where nobody's really validated that this construct is an independent construct and deserves to be, pulled together as one dimension, or whether it breaks up in very different ways. So hopefully one message that we can think about is whether some of the information can be more biologically driven. If we're going to go through the trouble of doing all these biological measurements, other than asking people and looking at their brain function, why can't we use the brain to teach us what the right categories are? And for that, it is really important to get back to Ross's point about what can we believe, and what can we believe in this moment about that person, as opposed to this person over time, and so on. So if we really mean for the biology to become our framework, like the cancer people are hoping for precision medicine to be primarily driven by biology to inform treatment and prevention, then we really do need to trust the reliability of our measures. So.
I was just going to add that as a mostly animal researcher, the RDoc left us sort of perplexed as to what we were supposed to do. So, we spent a lot of time early on building animal models that have various characteristics of psychiatric diseases, a whole battery of characteristics that were, similar to depression or bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or whatever. And then the RDoc sort of came along, and then we were kind of asked to study each thing in isolation, which I'm not sure if that's really the best approach when, you're talking about someone with bipolar disorder, for example, which has a lot of different phenotype features, including brain-body features, not just things going on in the brain, but, metabolism and all kinds of different things. And so I think the animal research community is still kind of struggling with what to do with that. What's really the best approach?
Even though it's supposed to help us, but
yeah, right. Yeah.
Did you want to say?
No, I was just going to say, at least from the cognitive neuroscience perspective, I sort of feel like RDoC has been a good inspiration to look at things from a dimensional perspective. So concretely, doing predictive modeling of continuous measures of behavior or symptoms, or some data-driven subtyping rather than a binary or categorical classification. I think that has sort of grown in frequency as people are considering the fact that symptoms exist on a continuum. So for example, when we predict ADHD symptoms, we get significant predictions of symptom scores even in people without ADHD diagnoses. So even in quote unquote healthy people, there is still variability in attention function in real life. And so the dimensional approach has sort of helped capture that variability.
Yeah, I guess my comments kind of comes after that. It's sort of the same point, but a little bit differently. So I think, I'm not an RDoC spokesperson by any means, and I don't really use it, but I think the idea of how we carve nature at its joints could be questioned at any level of analysis. So it needn't necessarily be biologically informed. I mean, many of the psychological domains that are characterized have been assessed via a number of tasks. I mean, if you would argue that certain mental health states are characterized by subjective states of distress or suffering of various kinds, or of positive states of various kinds, we do have good measures of those that are derived from self-reports or performance-based tasks too. So I think that, that's also a standard against which any measure might be held. Now, if the goal is to have a biological measure and whether or not those map on, I think that's one of the open questions the RDoC approach and other approaches are striving to take. But I wouldn't necessarily say that you couldn't have that sort of same standard at a purely behavioral or a purely psychological level for construct.
I'm arguing for empirically based, evidence-based instead of committee-based.
Okay.
I would just...
as somebody who is a member of one of those RDoC committees, I would agree wholeheartedly.
I also think, if you actually look at the functional outcome of how people are writing and conducting their research based on RDoC, you realize it's very little actually following, some of the more detailed aspects of it. Again, it's more about the thematic aspects of it that I think are the more important parts, and it's actually the parts that are actually functional in how people are doing their work.
So, I think the issue. The RDoC takes us back to the issue of trait versus state and the idea of a continuum, but a continuum that may be fluid over situations and conditions and through life. And I'm wondering, we didn't really, I kept asking these questions about trait and state, but we didn't really fully address that as a topic. But I'm showing my bias here because I feel, I personally think about affective coping and affective disorders and stuff like that. And I think that there are nested concepts in there that could be disentangled biologically and even genetically and environmentally, where there are tendencies that I would call temperament, that I do genetic breeding for, that reflect styles of coping with the environment. Is it active coping? Is it passive coping? Do you go attack or do you hide? Are you, that sort of stuff. And those are changeable but fairly stable, and even in humans there are studies from the marshmallow test on that have shown that they translate, and worms have differences along that trait of how much they explore versus how much they take their lumps and stay on the same culture that they've been in, even if it's not perfect for them, versus they leave and see if there is something better out there, all the way to humans. These are features that are adaptive for a species to have variability in that trait of how much you explore and how you cope. And there is genetics to them. That's a very big context versus the intermediate context of then how do you respond to stress within adolescence if you're this phenotype or that, if you have an active versus passive coping style, versus your moment-to-moment response to what's happening to you, including whether you had caffeine or not this morning. So to me, these time-nested ways of thinking, including behaviorally and biologically, might be really important as we think about measurement. And Russ, actually, in your stuff about your own repeated testing, I was flabbergasted about how consistent you are. And I thought that was actually extremely encouraging. I don't know if that's what you took away from it, but you are a lot less variable. Maybe you're a very steady human being. I doubt that I would look that way. But nevertheless.
No. I think the Midnight Scan Club data have shown pretty clearly that, that in general connectivity patterns are really stable within an individual. Now that's holding things constant, like time of day and stuff like that. But I agree. I mean, it's sort of you could view it as being really stable, or you can focus on the things that change. But I think you're right. If you compare the variability within me to the variability across people, it's really striking how different it is. But it's not just me.
Yeah. So that I sort of want to come away from this with not only the challenges, but what we can sort of maybe not quite take to the bank, but at least have in our back pocket to take to the bank. And it sounds to me, both from what you said and from Monica, what she said, is that there are stable patterns in people against which we can work and gather information based on how they're doing, other things that are impacting their situation, including drugs, and maybe if they exercise or so on. So I take that as a hopeful sign. Would you agree? You're shaking your head. Do you agree?
Right, I agree. I think I agree that there are these stable patterns that have been consistently observed across several data sets with, high frequency sampling of a small number of individuals. So I think that does bode well for capturing models that predict trait-like behaviors.
And, when Colleen, for example, talks about night people and morning people, right, and what happens through life to them, that's pretty stable, right?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it changes with age, as I mentioned, but once people are sort of past adolescence and sort of, before age, maybe 60, 65 or so, that's pretty stable. You're pretty much, you have a trait of being a night owl or being a morning type or somewhere in between. It's a spectrum, right? But, and the genes, a lot of the variants that are responsible for this are known, and 23andMe actually just did a large study of their data and found polymorphisms in circadian genes, as you might expect, that associated specifically with traits of being a morning person or a nighttime person. So yeah, those are pretty stable.
So it seems like we should be able to talk about, as we move forward, to talk about definitions, which I want to get back to now, and how to go about measuring them. We should probably sort out what we can find reliably within us. If we're talking about at the individual level, and it was really important to point out to all the traps and potholes into that, it might be good to take stock then of what we can be certain about. And we just gave a couple of 3 examples of things we can be certain about that are the general framework or a signature for how that brain is functioning, how that individual is functioning, and then within that, how it changes either when things are declining or are improving, and how we can distinguish within subject at least what spells good news versus bad news, right? Yeah? Is that a takeaway? No? I'm going to go with it. I'm going to call it a win. So we have a comment from Dr. Luke Stokel from NIA Online, who sent us a proposed definition of resilience in the context of brain health. He says, sheer number of neurocognitive tools, networks that we have available to activate in the context of environmental and psychological challenges. So he's talking about both internal and external environmental challenges and psychological challenges. So that's one component of his proposed definition. And the second component is the ability to activate these tools and networks in an adaptive manner to optimize function in response to environmental and psychological challenges. And he's asking us to not make the distinction between cognitive and affective. So any comments on that proposed definition of resilience in the context of brain health?
I think it's sort of related to the, we were talking about with Damien's question earlier, which is, I think, you can think of this flexibility, right? The fact that, resilience might mean that you can bring more different things online. That's sort of, in some sense, the opposite of test-retest reliability, right? That, a person with more flexibility is going to look less like themselves from time point to time point. So I think that actually, getting at relating, sort of treating variability and flexibility as a phenotype is actually I agree, a really important thing, and that, hasn't really gotten a lot of attention. It's getting some attention in the kind of network neuroscience world with these kind of flexibility measures, but I think that treating that as a first-class phenotype is actually a really important thing.
So thank you. This morning I said that we need to use our neuroplasticity wisely, because it's not an infinite amount, but we have some. But the other idea that I didn't really talk about is that is whether there is a way to increase or continue to maintain our sort of reserves of neuroplasticity. And if you ask me as an old person what my goal is in life, it has been how do you continue to stay flexible as you age? And I mean that intellectually and emotionally as well as physically. So how do you not stiffen up? To me, is part of being resilient. And resilience has that meaning of elasticity in it. And so how do you not stiffen up for who you are? I'm not ever going to be like a gymnast physically, for example, and I won't have the acrobatic abilities of certain really talented, flexible people. But for what I have, I think of my own goal as maintaining that flexibility. And I think that speaks directly to having more resources to call upon, whether you call them affective or cognitive. And what I think happens in this whole story about depression, the depressed brain, and growth factors, which I have worked on, and we discovered FGF as a growth factor that's lacking in depression or dysregulated in depression, is exactly the point that Russ just made, that actually noise in the brain is a good thing. And that a goal in life is to not minimize it. And what is happening in early life is that huge amount of flexibility that is there. You do get the pruning because too much is also bad for you, but there you start with a lot of options in the brain. And how quickly you hone them down, and if you hone them down to too few options and life doesn't go the way of those options, then I think that's when you can't cope, you can't rebound. So I hope that idea that we heard about, that we got that suggestion about having, a range of a bag of tricks, if you will, the number of cognitive tools is something that we can measure, and the ability to roll with the punches, it partly depends on having more than one coping strategy, not one coping strategy. So I wanted to keep that towards the end because I quite like the idea. I resonate with it. But it's a big headache for having one measure, right? If you're going to measure it, it's individualized measurement of, and in a way it has a personalized and cognitive aspect about how you're not losing your plasticity over time. That to me is the definition of resilience. But any other thoughts on that, comments, differences, or anything else that anybody wants to say? The panel here. Russ? Okay? No? All right. Well, thank you all. Thank you for sticking with us all day long. And we'll see you tomorrow. Different room? 8:30. Room 125. Room 125. Thank you very much. My thanks to all the speakers, to all the people who brought up questions, and to all of you who listened and participated.
Everybody else.